Berserkhead here, and welcome to my new series called History with Berserkhead, in which I'm going to be talking about, well, history. So basically the premise of the series is that I'm going to be asking a question that I'm going to be answering in a video, and I'm going to be doing a really massive research prior to making the video, and I'm going to be giving you a really detailed answer to the question. And in this episode, as you can probably read from the title, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've wanted to talk for a very long time, and that is, did the Vikings wear horn helmets? Now, let's get to the question straight away and try and answer it as quickly as possible at the start. So, did the Vikings wear horn helmets in battle, as we often see them depicted in various movies, pictures, whatever, you name it? The simple answer is no, they didn't. And the main reason behind it is that wearing something like this is extremely impractical. You know, Norsemen would usually like to have long hair and long beards, but those members of the society that were actually warriors and that did a lot of fighting would usually keep their hair shorter and their beard shorter because, once again, it's impractical. Why is it impractical? Because in melee fight, something like this is pretty much a handle for your opponent. It's just something that they can grab on, throw you off balance, and that's a disadvantage. Same goes for hairs and beards, so that's why they didn't wear any of those things in battle. Now, we see some horn helmets and other impractical items worn in battle. Two very good examples are those horn helmets worn by the Teutonic Knights, or those wings worn by the Polish winged hussars. Now, both of these are impractical, and the reason for this is because you basically don't want, gigantic horns sticking out of your helmet or just wings sticking out of your back. You don't want those things. But the difference is, those were worn by cavalrymen, whereas the Vikings didn't have any cavalry for the most part. Scandinavians started implementing some cavalry in their battles after the Viking Age, but they've never been known for being good cavalrymen. So most, if not all of the Vikings would usually fight on their feet and not on horseback. And when you're fighting in a cavalry battle, it doesn't really matter if you're wearing those things. They're just not, it's extra weight. It makes you slower and stuff like that. But it's not really something that your opponent can grab onto and throw you off balance, as I mentioned earlier. No one's gonna, especially an infantryman, they can't go that high to, reach that horn or that wing. So those are not as impractical when being worn by cavalrymen. However, when it comes to an infantry battle, stuff like that is really, really important. And that's why they wouldn't have worn horn helmets. And no one would have worn horn helmets in battle, in a real historical battle for that matter. Because, once again, in melee fighting, something like this is very, very impractical. Okay, so we got that out of the way. But let's ask a more broad question. Did the Vikings wear horn helmets in any occasion, and do horn helmets have anything to do with the Vikings? In order to answer that question, we're gonna have to make a pretty long trip throughout history and go back thousands of years back to the Greco-Roman world. And first of all, I want to define a term. I want to define the term barbarian. So nowadays, when we say barbarian, we usually mean someone who is uncivilized. Usually, as nowadays we refer to the barbarians as, Gallic, Celtic, Germanic tribes, right? However, that's not the original meaning of the term barbarian. What barbarian used to mean in Latin, in the original meaning of the word that was used in the Greco-Roman world in antiquity, basically a barbarian was someone who didn't belong to the Greco-Roman. So basically someone who was not Roman or Greek. So yes, those tribes would be considered barbarians, but you could say that the Persians and those tribes to the east as well, that you would consider to be more civilized, would still be considered barbarian. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, the Romans were very tolerant towards other cultures and other religions, and usually when they would conquer a tribe, they would let them keep their culture and their religion. The reason for this, according to me at least, is that they simply didn't care. So when the Romans would usually conquer a tribe, when they would discover a tribe, they would usually write down some things about them. But once again, for them, these would be just barbarians. So usually they wouldn't have had a very good depiction of what they really looked like, and they wouldn't have had a very good idea of what their culture was like. because they didn't really make a good distinction between Gallic tribes, Germanic tribes, Celtic tribes, and all those peoples to the north. For them, they were just, once again, barbarians. As I said, the Romans didn't really care too much about their culture. So when they would write down things about them, there would be certain inconsistencies because they couldn't make that clear distinction between who is who. And here comes the thing with the horn helmets. Back in the day when those scholars would write down things about those tribes, they would mention that they wear horn helmets. Now, I can't give you an exact example of that, but we know that the Romans did have some sort of a depiction in their heads of those tribes to the north wearing some sort of horn helmets. Now, that could be misinterpreted because a horn helmet might be a skinned animal with their horns. So, for example, they would skin a deer and then wear its pelt over their head, and there would be the horn sticking out. So that could be considered a horn helmet as well. But we do have, we do know that the Romans knew that some of those tribes, or at least they thought that some of those tribes used horn helmets. However, they didn't clarify that they didn't wear those helmets in battle. And then we gotta go forward in history to the Romantic period. What's very typical for the Romantic period, and in fact the reason we call it the Romantic period, is the fact that people that would, create art or just write things, or generally educated people would be very interested and look for inspiration in those texts that were written by the Romans and the Greeks back in antiquity. Those same texts that would say that those tribes to the north would wear horn helmets. And so a lot of those artists and authors and poets and you name it, they would want to create works about those peoples. And once again, since they would get their inspiration from the texts that were written by the Romans, in their heads, they didn't have a very clear distinction between different cultures to the north. So, once again, there would be certain inconsistencies when it comes to those depictions of those people. And so, this is kind of how the modern trend of depicting Vikings with horn helmets began. Now, a very good example, and an example that's usually given, for a very typical work that depicted the Vikings with horn helmets, is one of Wagner's operas, which I can't pronounce its name, but you can see it on the screen right now. It's in German. My German's not great. But yeah, that's the name of the opera, which told a story about the Vikings. So the story goes, I don't know how true that is, but once again, that's what I've gathered from my research, is that the costume maker for the opera, so when they would perform the opera, the costume maker decided to give the Vikings costumes that would include horn helmets. And since the opera was very popular, a lot of people saw it, and they thought that that was a very accurate depiction of the Vikings. And then this just kept on going because a lot of, the Vikings were depicted this way by a lot of painters. Once again, it all started in the Romantic period. And the main reason for this is that those people that would create works during the Romantic period would get inspiration from the text by the Romans, who didn't really have a clear distinction in their heads about who is who and what they actually wore. And those same Romans would write down that some of those tribes would wear horn helmets without any clarification. So that's the main reason why we have so many depictions of the Vikings wearing horn or wing helmets. Okay, so that's out of the way, and now we know why this depiction is so popular nowadays. But does it have to do anything with history? Because earlier when I asked the question, I added in battle, and I wanted to say that really clearly. Did the Vikings wear horn helmets in battle? No. But did they wear horn helmets, and do horn helmets have anything to do with the Vikings? Let's find out. Well, the answer to this would actually be yes. And I know that's going to surprise a lot of people because that's information that's generally not out there, but it's actually very well proven. So we have very good archaeological evidence that, in fact, some of those people would wear horn helmets. However, we don't really have a good explanation as to what their purpose was. A very, very good example from the Viking era are those two helmets found in Denmark. You can see they're helmets, they have horns. Now, how do we know they weren't worn in battle? Well, very simple. These are simply too sophisticated and too fragile to be worn in battle. in battle, this thing wouldn't have given you any protection if you were actually to wear it. So that's how we know that they had some sort of a ceremonial purpose. Now, to reinforce this, we also have this depiction of a Viking burial, which depicts a guy wearing a horn helmet, kind of looking similar to this one. We also have other archaeological evidence of the Celtic tribes wearing wind helmets during, once again, religious ceremonies. And that's why we might have some depictions of the Vikings wearing wind helmets, because once again, this confusion between the peoples and who's Germanic, who's Celtic, and so on and so forth. You know, for some people, the Celts and the Vikings or the Norsemen would be the same thing. So that's why they would depict the Vikings with wind helmets. But yeah, horn helmets, Germanic paganism, wind helmets, Celtic paganism. That's a very clear distinction that we should make. And yes, there is further archaeological evidence to support this, because we found just pieces of similar helmets found pretty much all over the place. But this is a very good example because those helmets are very well preserved. And based on those depictions, we can kind of say that the Vikings wore horn helmets in certain ceremonies. However, once again, we don't have a very clear idea as to what their purpose was and why they actually wore them, like what they symbolized and so on and so forth. But yeah, once again, horn helmets, yes. In certain cases, wind helmets, never. And now another question that might be interesting for some people who might not be so well versed in history. What helmets did the Vikings actually wear? Now that's another kind of thing which we can't really give a clear answer to. The only Viking helmet per se is this helmet, which was found in Norway. Now the reason why this helmet is so important is because this is the only helmet which we can just point to and say this is a Viking helmet. We don't have another clear example, of such a well-preserved helmet, definitely from the Viking period. So this was found at a Viking burial, and once again, it is very well preserved. Once again, we find pieces of helmets all over the place, but we can't really construct a clear idea of what kind of helmets they wore. Now, based on other archaeological evidence, we can say that the Vikings maybe wore, similar types of helmets, but that would be only for the nobles, because equipment back in the day, especially in the Middle Ages, was very expensive. So we can say that most of them probably didn't wear helmets, since that was something very expensive. But as for the nobles, they wore probably similar types of helmets. Another good example are the helmets from the Vendel period found in Sweden. So it was probably something like this, just a little bit more advanced. As for other simpler helmets that they wore, pretty much helmets that were worn around Western Europe as well, such as leather caps, which was a very cheap type of head protection, not very efficient one, but still some of them wore some of that. The Norman helmets, for sure, and maybe just round helmets. We can also say that maybe some of them wore, again, a similar type of helmet as this one that I showed you, but there was just chainmail hanging from it to cover the rest of the face. So yeah, they would wear all sorts of different helmets based on how rich they were, what they could afford, and how important it was to them. But yeah, this is the one that we can point to and say that it's a typical, specific Viking helmet. So what's the reason why that's the only helmet that we found that's a good, well-preserved helmet that's not broken into pieces from the Viking period that was actually worn by a Viking noble? Well, a good explanation for it, this is just a hypothesis. We can't tell if that's actually true, but I think it gives a pretty good explanation as to why that is. But certain people think that those sorts of items, such as armor and helmets, including, were passed on from generation to generation. And so a lot of those would be lost. They would be either broken, or a lot of them, as time goes on, these wouldn't have been worn in battle. So a lot of people would just sell them for scrap for the most part, so they would be melted and turned into something else. Or they would be just, broken. As I said, we've found a lot of pieces from those Viking helmets. And I think very good evidence to support this claim would be the Normans. We know that the Normans had some Viking heritage. Their ancestors would go from Scandinavia and settle to what we nowadays know as Normandy. And basically, when the Normans invaded Britain, they would wear equipment that's very similar to that of the Vikings. And it was basically modified Viking gear. And so a good reason for that might be because the Viking equipment was just passed from generation to generation, and they would just modify it a little bit. So I think that's really good evidence to actually support this claim. So yeah, that's gonna be pretty much for this video, I think. I gave you a pretty in-depth explanation as to why the Vikings didn't wear horn helmets in battle, and also why they're depicted this way nowadays, and why it's such a popular depiction. And I know a lot of people realize that the Vikings didn't wear horn helmets. As we get more evidence and as we get more, archaeological findings, our view on things changes and, gets more and more popular. And, nowadays a lot of people know that the Vikings didn't wear those horn helmets. It's also such a popular belief. But they don't know why they're actually depicted this way, and a lot of people don't know what kind of helmets did the Vikings actually wear. Because once again, there might be some false information out there about it. We still see so many Hollywood movies and stuff like that depict a lot of things wrong, and that's very much true for the Vikings. And ever since the day I found out that the Vikings didn't actually wear horn helmets, which was quite a long time ago, I've been wondering as to why we believe that. Sometimes that's the interesting part of history, just learning those little details. And I hope that this video was interesting for you exactly for this reason. So yeah, that's it for the first episode of the series. Once again, there are going to be more episodes, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff. But I'm going to be talking a lot about the Vikings, since I wouldn't call it my specialty, but that's, I guess, my biggest passion when it comes to history. I like to learn a lot about the Vikings. So yeah, if you want to watch more similar content, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more videos like that in the future. And really hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Goodbye.